Yeah, it's a beautiful question, and thankfully one that is getting more attention, not just in the research space and the clinical space, but with the athletes themselves. So sleep itself is a non-negotiable biological necessity, and it has such a vast impact on our acute functioning day to day and our long-term health. And for the athlete population, on one end you're thinking about the acute day to day fluctuations and trying to enhance performance on one end. Think quicker, have clearer thoughts, physically be faster. At the same time, potentially also have better emotional regularity. So when you're in regulation, so when you're actually in competition, you're able to perform in a manner you want to, rather than letting having your emotions affect you. And then two, you think about this for athletes, it's really important that you're actually able to train, practice, and perform in competition, which requires health, which requires injury prevention, which requires recovery from injury as well. And so it plays a whole role in the athlete's ability to prepare for competition through training, recover from injuries, muscle growth, continue to improve themselves physically, and then even when we get to the actual performance, be able to perform at their best in that acute setting as well. It's a great question, and a question that translates across kind of all populations and not just specific to athletes. And what's critical here is, yes, we have these general guidelines about sleep health. A lot of people hear 8 hours of sleep duration per night, or 7 to 9 if you're a young to middle-aged adult. And yet at the same time, there's such huge variability inter-individually between our sleep need and the type of sleep we're able to get as well, based on where we are in our lifespan, whether we're adolescent, whether we're young adults, whether we're older adults, sleep changes. And so we should never use a one-size-fits-all approach generally. And then a bigger part of this puzzle, if you will, is the fact that the circadian rhythm, this biological clock inside of us, plays such a key role in regulating sleep and wake. And we must be mindful that there are variations in that inter-individually. And so for me, I'm a morning lark, and so the timing of my sleep probably should be different from someone who has circadian characteristics that are more eveningness. And if we don't factor those things into the equation, we might be actually doing more harm than good from trying to structure a schedule. Training schedules and travel are huge variables that can negatively influence an athlete's sleep behaviors and ability. First of all, when you're traveling, you're generally probably going across time zones. And so we're causing an acute disruption to that circadian rhythm, and we really want that to be aligned as best as possible. We see chronic circadian desynchrony in populations like shift workers, and we see how deleterious those effects are. But even the subtle changes day to day, by having that disruption, can cause major significant impact on performance and also leave us more susceptible to kind of unwanted health outcomes like injury or illness. So on one end, it's the time zone travel. And then at the same time, it could just be the distance traveled and the manner in which we do it, where we're putting ourselves in usually cramped spaces, cars, airplanes, whatever it may be, buses, that are not optimal for us to get blood flow, oxygen, that are really useful for us to recover if we've just come out of a sporting event, and so on and so forth. So the travel for the competitions themselves, huge variable. Training causes a lot of stress on the body, and I think this is an area that is growing in attention and consideration of how to best modify this, because this is a modifiable aspect of an athlete's preparation for competition, is how much training do they really need to reach their best self, and avoiding overtraining or unnecessary training. And when we train so much, one, we're cutting out hours in the day that we're actually able to sleep, and two, we're creating more need for that sleep. So they're kind of this incongruent relationship there, where we're cutting down on the thing that we need most because we're having more training and harder training, and yet we're not able to provide that. Yeah, so it's generally inevitable that an athlete's going to travel, especially elite athletes, student athletes, professional athletes, at a sizable amount across their calendar season to perform. So we want to be as best prepared for those things as we can before going into the actual season. And so we want to first always start with what we can control, which is our abilities from a cognitive and behavioral standpoint to have good, healthy sleep behaviors and practices. So leveraging as much as we can from the kind of generally utilized sleep interventions to entrain healthy adaptive thoughts about sleep, to understand a wind down routine is important to allow us to transition into the sleep period, to maintain a consistent wake time, to have these things really in place already before going through travel. And then when we're actually preparing for a competition, we can potentially do a little bit of adjustment ahead of time. If we really want to have our biological clock aligned in a certain manner that will allow us to perform optimally in that environment, then we can use things like light, meal timing, and physical activity that inform the clock, the circadian system, and can adjust it one way or another, forwards or backwards, depending on which way we're going. And so that's the most kind of intimate way that we can adjust the circadian rhythm, those three factors, but most principally light. And so those things can be leveraged. I will candidly say that there's granularity in all of this that we don't quite know yet, and so there's no one-size-fits-all prescription of how to best do that. And yet that may be the best strategy to prepare someone if they are going through time zones and they have concern that there will be some dysregulation there. It's a really good question, and I think I'll just start candidly from like a research perspective that we don't really know yet on how these factors truly principally moderate sleepability and quality for athletes. We're starting to learn about that more in kind of just population level broadly, and I think it's important that the attention to what you're eating, when you're eating, those types of things, what effects those have on short and long-term outcomes is really, really important. We do know that oftentimes with athletes, due to competition times that are often later in the evening, they may be more susceptible to eating later at night. And that can have a negative influence on your circadian rhythm, as we're sending a signal to the circadian rhythm at that point to be awake, as digestion is a wake behavior. So that's one thing to be mindful of here. And also at the same time, we're also susceptible to craving unhealthier foods at that time, just based on the kind of toll of the cognitive day. And so we may not make the healthiest choices. And so it's really important to kind of be mindful of those factors and try best to be satiated throughout the day and use our healthiest, best recovery techniques from a dietary perspective after. And then again, diet's a really complex thing, and it needs to be personalizable. We are starting to know some aspects of the relationships between diet and sleep, but it's still uncertain. And so there's no way to make a recommendation right now that like a ketogenic approach or a more carbohydrate-rich approach is one way or another better for all. And it really is coming back to just kind of this generalized strategy of there are some basic principles, probably avoiding high sugary foods as much as possible, and then understanding and listening to yourself and adjusting based on that. So sleep problems are very common in athletes when it comes to poor sleep quality, regularly disrupted sleep due to acute insomnia characteristics, and beyond that too, unfortunately, sleep disorders themselves are also very prevalent. And the two most common you would run into most likely are insomnia disorder and obstructive sleep apnea. And still within that too, you have restless leg syndrome or periodic limb movement disorder that athletes also experience that can cause some problems. Generally, when it comes to insomnia, you're not really going to rely on objective measurement. Like clinically, people are not brought into a sleep lab to diagnose insomnia. And wearable devices, actigraphy and the commercial devices can be vulnerable to misestimations in insomnia because they have some limitations in that area. So when it comes to that, it's often relied upon from a self-report perspective, talking with the provider, and I always encourage somebody to reach out to a behavioral sleep medicine specialist when they're available. And with obstructive sleep apnea, there are some really nice emerging technologies that are conveniently in the home that can monitor ambiently and provide some insight into risk as screening tools. But oftentimes what's most leveraged is not really an in-lab study, which is highly sensitive and very useful, but a home sleep apnea test. And those can be more readily available, especially with working in insurance. And so those are ways to, screen for those disorders that are most common in that sense. So sleep itself regulates, or aspects of sleep that occur when we're sleeping play key roles in so many different aspects of physiological repair, whether it's the cellular level, the tissue level, whatever it may be. And so it allows us to, repair upon that which we damaged due to the performance itself. And disruptions in sleep, when we're not able to sleep well, we may not be able to access key levels of sleep that regulate those aspects. So we know that human growth hormone is intimately regulated by the deeper stages of non-REM sleep. And so if you're not able to stay in that sleep stage longer or access it more readily, you may be more susceptible to reductions there that leave you more vulnerable to longer recovery, or at the same time, you may have immunodeficiencies or deficiencies in your immune system because of sleep restriction or sleep deprivation and a dampened immune system that leave you more susceptible to illness on that front. Yeah, there's some really good literature out there that from a laboratory-based perspective, we can see that changes in sleep parameters like extending sleep longer or increasing the continuity of our sleep, which could be falling asleep in less time or ability to stay asleep better, translates into observable benefits for athletes such as improved free throw percentage, improved three-point percentage, or even just physical characteristics like increased V02 Max. And so you can see these widespread, and we do see that there are sport-specific variations in this sense, that some sports may be more acutely sensitive to these changes than others, and yet we are able to see these effects. A big question becomes, though, at times, how meaningful are these in the actual game performance themselves? Some of the research that I've done has shown that, yes, we see these changes, however, it's unclear, scientifically they're significant, but when it comes to the game actual scenario, does it have a meaningful impact on the game? And that's stuff that perhaps is true, and we just need more research and more cohesion between teams to do that. Yeah, I just want to appreciate the opportunity to speak on it. It's a population that is highly vulnerable to sleep issues. I personally have a much empathy for the student-athlete population in general, and elite athletes who may not even be professional, as you often are carrying multiple jobs on that front. You're a student and an athlete. You're often taking care of your family. You may have other jobs as well, social demands, and so you're finding a way to maintain this critically important thing in your life, this identity of sport, while trying to stay healthy in the short term and long term. And there's just not more hours in the day to do it all. And so that often leads to curtailing a sleep window, to squeeze in a training period, and other aspects that are deleterious to our sleep health. And so I just want to say that if you are an athlete out there and you struggle with your sleep, there are resources available. There are providers out there that can help. And the other side of it too is always trying to establish a relationship here where it's a priority, but not a pressure. Anytime we're putting too much pressure on your sleep, probably going to lead to worse sleep outcomes that way. But let's try and build sleep as a priority into our lives to be better tomorrow and long term.